may want to back. Okay, and I think you just got asked if you're okay with the recording in progress. Yes, so we're going to talk about this book, People Love Dead Jews. I'll just say a couple of things. First of all, it's a very interesting experience to, if you have a Kindle, you don't quite get this, to walk around the world carrying this book, right? And where people look at the title, they sort of go, they look at you a little bit funny when they see the title of what you're reading. This book has made the rounds in the Jewish world. I was saying at the beginning, before everybody got on, that Daniel Gordis on his podcast just did an interview with Dara Horn way back in September when the book came out. Yehuda Kurtzer did a very interesting conversation with Dara Horn on his podcast called The Identity Crisis. Dara Horn also, I didn't realize this, but I just started listening to it over the last few days. She did her own podcast called Adventures with Dead Jews. She's very whimsical, and it has a lot of material that didn't make it into the book. Some of it because, in her words, it was just too strange to include. So it's I think there's 6 or 7 podcasts that you can go back and listen to as well. But the book is getting a lot of conversation. I had a chance to read it over the last month or so and thought it would be a good thing for us to talk about. And what I would like to do is I essentially, I'm just curious, raise your hand if you've had the opportunity to read it, if you read it in advance. No, okay, so a few people did, most people didn't. If you didn't, I commend it to you. It's definitely worth reading. And there may be some plot spoilers, but I still think the overall effect of reading the book will be worth it. What I'd like to do is to, I basically highlighted sections that I thought were fascinating, and I want to just read a few of those sections and stop to ask you, what do you think of this, right? What do you think of her arguments, of what she says? So it's not going to be more complicated than that. I don't think we're going to get through all of my highlighted sections because there were a lot of them. There's a lot of insights in this book, but we'll do some of them. And if anybody who read the book has a particular thing that they want to raise, I'm happy to hear that too. I'll just say one other thing by way of introduction. The book is titled People Love Dead Jews, and probably the most famous anecdote that she begins the book with is a visit to the Anne Frank house. And she basically, well, I don't know whether she goes there, but she basically writes about how in 2018, the Anne Frank house had an Orthodox Jew who was on the staff and wanted to wear his kippah to be on the staff, and wanted to wear his kippah to work, and was essentially told no, that he needed to hide his kippah underneath a baseball cap because it would be disturbing, or because it would be controversial, or for whatever reason. And he essentially brought this, up the chain, and the board took 4 months to deliberate whether or not his wearing the kippah would violate the museum's stated goal of neutrality. And I'll just read to you a few sentences. One spokesman explained to the British newspaper Daily Mail, if a live Jew in a yarmulke might interfere with the museum's independent position. And the museum finally relented after deliberating for 4 months, she writes, which seems like a rather long time for the Anne Frank house to ponder whether it was a good idea to force a Jew into hiding. and she's sort of dripping with irony as she says that. She also recounted that that of all of the languages, when you get the guides that you put in your ear and tell you about the museum as you go around. So for the French guide, there was a flag of France, and for English, there was a British flag, and for Spanish, there was either a Spanish flag or a Mexican flag, whatever it was. But for Hebrew, there was no flag. There was no flag. And the point that she's making is that, is that there seems to be a discomfort with live Jews at a place that likes to tell a redemptive story, which is the Anne Frank Museum. The most famous line, and here I'm over on page 9 for those who want to follow along. Most famous line of Anne Frank: "I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart," which is sort of a universal and very comforting message that comes out of the Anne Frank story. But it ignores the fact that that a couple of weeks after she wrote that line, she met people who were not truly good at heart and who actually killed her. And let me just read to you this passage. And it's in the middle of page 9. She says, "These words, 'I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart,' are inspiring, by which we mean that they flatter us. They make us feel forgiven for those lapses of our civilization that allow for piles of murdered girls. And if those words came from a murdered girl, well, then we must be absolved because they must be true." She argues they get that gift of grace and absolution from a murdered Jew, exactly the gift that lies at the heart of Christianity, is what millions of people are so eager to find in Frank's hiding place, in her writings, in her legacy. She says, "It is far more gratifying to believe that an innocent dead girl has offered us grace than to recognize the obvious. Frank wrote about people being truly good at heart before meeting people who weren't. 3 weeks after writing these words, she met people who weren't." And I guess, the first thing I'm curious to talk about together with you is, what do you think of this idea that the interest in the Anne Frank story on behalf of the world comes from a desire to feel forgiven for the crimes that were committed against the Jewish people? Go ahead, Jane.
Unmute.
Your husband is helping you with your Zoom.
You're still not unmuted. You're still not.
Lower left. Lower left.
She puts her glasses on. She might be able to see. No? You're not on. You're still not. Why don't you come into this room? You're not mute. You're still there. You go.
Okay. I think most people feel, as they should, guilty about what happened in the Holocaust, either because they did it, or they didn't stop it, or they hoped it would take place. I'm not talking about Jews. I'm talking about most non-Jews. They feel guilty, and yes, they're looking for some kind of forgiveness.
I'll
But
disagree.
But they should feel guilty.
I'll
Richard, go ahead.
I have
I
never
guess
thought of.
I guess there's a reason why you guys are doing this from different rooms.
I have nenever thought of it as something that absolved anybody. I always thought of it as telling a terrible story, and not that the people reading it. I mean, first of all, those people who were around then, most of them, almost none of them are around now, so they're not personally guilty of what happened then, and to me, it was a message saying this shouldn't happen again. I mean, I don't see readers of it. I mean, it's been used to teach people that this is a terrible thing, that we shouldn't let this happen again. Not that anybody should feel guilty. And that's sort of, I hate, I mean, I'm bringing in something a little different here, but that's one of the arguments against the critical race theory that makes people feel guilty about things that have happened in the past. No, it makes us realize what happened in the past so we don't let it happen again.
But it happens all the time.
Well,
No,
Richard, let me see if I can let me see if I can sharpen the point here. I think what she's getting at is that let me actually come at this from a different example in the book. Another thing which she points out, and many people don't know this, is that when Elie Wiesel first wrote Night, it was not written in English. It was not written, I don't even believe, I could be wrong, Martha, please tell me if I'm wrong about this. I don't think it was written in French. I think it was written in Yiddish. Is that right?
Oh, that was a different version. The Night that we have in English was written in French.
No, I understand, but the earlier version of Night was written in Yiddish, I believe.
And the title was "And the World Stood Silent."
And the title was "And the World Stood Silent." And essentially, in order for it to be published, Wiesel changed the focus of the book. The focus of the Yiddish version of "And the World Stood Silent" was essentially a devastating critique and anger at the brutality of Germans and the brutality of those who committed the Holocaust, committed the crimes of the Holocaust. And Wiesel in Night turns it into a theological accusation against God, with less focus on anger at the people who did it. And the argument, Richard, to come back to this, is that actually Jews, that those type of stories become, in order for them to become more popular, have to focus less on actual Jewish suffering and more on the lessons, sort of the moral fables that or the moral conclusions that are drawn from them. And her claim is that, she says later on in the book that, the problem with that logic is, for example, she says that a lot of times the argument is that Jews are canaries in the mine. And she says the problem with that logic is that the essence of that logic is Jews are being killed, and if Jews are being killed, then some real people might be killed eventually. As opposed to, hey, there's actually a problem with Jews being killed, right? As Jews, who are different from you, who don't look like you, and their lives should matter, not as sort of a lesson, but as that being a problem in and of itself. And I think the difference between that and critical race theory is that I think critical race theory is trying to focus on the cruelty done to Black Americans as slaves, and to Black, to African Americans throughout American history, and to focus on that cruelty and not to elide it, but not from a perspective of and therefore here are all we should all love each other, or, canaries in the mine. But no, that history has a legitimacy of its own, right? I don't want to, Harold, and then Richard, you can respond. I don't, so
Yeah.
go ahead.
So I hadn't thought about that perspective before reading the book. And I must say, it really rang true to me and struck me very hard that all of this, a lot of the emphasis on sort of talking about the Holocaust and the Holocaust story and stories are on this, really minuscule proportion of what actually happened, namely the people who survived and the people who were saved, people who, righteous Gentiles who saved people. And actually the large majority of what happened wasn't that at all. And she gives an example later on talking about this traveling show about Auschwitz, in which kind of the message at the end is that you need to have more love. And she points out, you don't need to have more love. It wasn't about love. It was about society taking responsibility for, basic actions. It wasn't anything about love at all. I mean, you don't have to love somebody not to murder them. It's much more elemental and basic kind of morality at stake here. And I think that gets really, that's she's right. And I think that gets really lost. Kind of the horror of it is lost in a lot of the way the story is told.
And so Harold, just because you mentioned that, I'm going to read from page 190. I'll read another paragraph from the book. And so people understand, there is a company, so I don't know, it feels like a very strange idea, but there's a company, I think it's called Muselia, which essentially, you may have heard of this company because if you heard about, there was an exhibit about human bodies. Did you hear about this, where they and you learn all about the human body and this company, it's not cheap, and scholars, they had all of the best scholars weigh in on this, to really try and bring, something factual and educated and informed to the table. And they do these with these exhibits, and they did something with the Holocaust as well. And let me just read what she writes on 190. It's towards the bottom. At the end of the show, on-screen survivors talk in a loop about how people need to love one another. While listening to this, it occurs to me that I have never read survivor literature in Yiddish. And by the way, Dara Horn is a professor of Yiddish literature. She has her degree from Harvard. I think she studied with Ruth Weiss there, because that's who does Yiddish literature at Harvard. And she, in her podcast about this book, she says, I spent the last 25 years not wanting to write this book. I write books about Jewish life, and I write books about Yiddish characters and Jewish culture. So she's read Yiddish literature in the original. So she says this with a lot of authority. She says, I've never read survivor literature in Yiddish, the language spoken by 80% of victims, suggesting this idea. In Yiddish, speaking only to other Jews, and by the way, this reminds me of Elie Wiesel's the first draft of Night, right, where he was speaking to other Jews, survivors talk about their murdered families, about their destroyed centuries-old communities, about Jewish national independence, about Jewish history, about self-defense, and on rare occasions, about vengeance. Love rarely comes up. Why would it?
Lou,
But it comes.
I can't hear.
Love rarely comes up. Why would it? But it comes up here in this for-profit exhibition. Here is the ultimate message. Here it is the ultimate message, meaning love is the ultimate message. And she says with a lot of irony, the final solution. And her argument is that there's, just by the way, I'll give you another example. I can't remember if this was in this one is in the book or it's just in the podcast. Martha, it is probably would be familiar to you. So at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial, there is a children's exhibit, and Dara Horn speaks in the podcast about going to the children's exhibit when she was 16 years old. She was a writer, a burgeoning writer, and she was employed by some Jewish teen magazine to do a review in 1993 of the newly opened U.S. Holocaust Memorial. And so she goes to the kids exhibit, and the kids exhibit, those of you who have been through it, it tells the story of an anonymous of a fictional boy named Daniel. Okay, and in Daniel's life, he's German, and it's the mid 1930s, and you see he's living in a house, and his house sort of looks like any other, or the room looks like the room of any other American teenager, and there's a soccer ball there, and there are medals from his father because his father is a veteran of World War I. He's a German, his father was a German Jewish soldier in World War I, and and then it sort of traces his life through that. And Dara Horn says, she makes the following point. She says, 85% of the people who died in the Holocaust were not, didn't have soccer balls. They were Yiddish speaking. They were either observant, and what they could have had in that room was, say, the father's tefillin. She went back and checked, and on the door of the room of the child in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Kids exhibit, there's no mezuzah. Okay, she says the kids were involved in socialist clubs. Some of them were involved in learning Hebrew because they were getting ready to make Aliyah to the land of Israel. I believe, by the way, that Anne Frank's sister was studying Hebrew, and was because she was looking forward to making Aliyah to Israel. Her point is that none of that whole element of lived Jewish culture is elided in the service of a lesson that is not necessarily it's certainly not the predominant lesson of the people who were killed in the Holocaust. And her concern is that there is an erasure of Jewish identity, an erasure of Jewish specialness and difference that is enlisted in the service of lessons, for her first point, to give people forgiveness, and ultimately in the service of lessons that are not, as Harold said, about this isn't about love, and it's about responsibility, and it's about human responsibility for what happened. Other thoughts or responses to any of that? Judy, go ahead.
First, I want to apologize. I had a very important telephone call I had to take, so I was away for a while. And if my comments aren't apropos because of what I missed, I apologize. But I see two competing interests here. I see exactly what she has to say, that it erases the Jewishness of the Holocaust in that way. But there's another interest, and I think that the message that they're trying to give is, this could be you. And I think that's an important message too.
Right, and she does speak about that, well, in this other podcast, she I'll tell you a little bit more of the story, that essentially she writes this glowing review of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Kids exhibit, and then she goes home and talks about it with, and basically some of her parents' friends or whatever. There's a Holocaust survivor there who listens to her and essentially says to her, there were no soccer balls, right? Like that, why didn't they have, Jewish things? And she says, hey, the point of the exhibit is to, convince people that this could have been them, right? To tell them that this could have been you. Her critique of that, Judy, comes back to something I said before, which is, isn't it bad enough that people who were not like you were killed? In other words, like, why is it necessary to make Jews, to assimilate Jews essentially in their suffering in order to make people care? It should be enough, it should be bad enough that Jews, right, who, yeah, they weren't like you, but they were murdered precisely for not being like you. That should be enough, right? I think that's a really core part of her argument. Daniel Morgan, I'll just put in the chat, would it have been okay if they were different, right? I think that's the wording from the podcast, right? Right? Like, if they didn't have a soccer ball, would that have made it okay, right? That's the fundamental thrust of her critique. But she recognizes there is something important, right? Of course, about Holocaust education, about connecting it to people's lives, but there's also, it's not uncomplicated, right? And she's very, very concerned that the people loving dead Jews is a way of saying, I love dead Jews, but live Jews who are different and who don't look like me and sound like me, not so much, right? And that it's sort of excusing that. Norma and then Martha, go ahead. Or Bob, I don't know who raised their hand.
So it was me. So yeah, I didn't read the book, but I have read a review of it. And actually in this issue, I get the Jewish Review of Books. There, a couple of issues ago, she wrote a review of a book called Jews Don't Count by David Baddiel, Baddiel, who writes about anti-Semitism in England. But what struck me about having read a couple of reviews about her book, and I do want to read the book, is how she points out how we, we've said this before in this discussion, how we, we revere what happened in the past. We build monuments, we build memorials, we have libraries and museums, and yet that becomes, the Holocaust kind of becomes the standard of treating Jews badly. But so much else is going on in the world. I mean, there's this tremendous rise of anti-Semitism, and yet those same people who talk about how bad it is, that, like, I guess the example you gave of, and in one of the reviews, this woman from a small town in Minsk talks about how now that all the Jews are down, this community feels like it's dead. But meanwhile, it may feel like that there, but meanwhile, there's certainly plenty of anti-Semitism, and Jews are treated bad in lots of places all over the world. We seem to kind of idealize what went on and hold that as a standard, but in today's society, we're not really looking at what happened and thinking about what kind of an impact that's having on the community. So we kind of, and Jews do this too. I mean, we spend a lot of effort and time on our memorials, on Yom HaShoah, and bringing speakers in to talk about what happened and listening to survivors or tapes of survivors. And yet there's so much going on in the community. And we're we're not helping, we're not giving our community the tools to deal with those with the same kind of effort and time and money that we pay to pay tribute to what happened in the past. So that's kind of
Well,
my
and let me respond and add a couple of pieces to that, and then Martha. So look, I know Roy is in this class, and a few others of you are in the class that I'm teaching on Israel's milestones. And part of what we did is read a piece that was written by Rabbi David Hartman of blessed memory after the 1982 Lebanon War. And the article was about Auschwitz or Sinai. And it's about the tension between those two moments as organizing principles for the modern Jewish community. And there is and his basic argument, he's writing about this in the wake of the Lebanon War because of the way in which Auschwitz was mobilized as in Israeli public discourse to justify going into Lebanon. But his point is much larger than that particular moment. His point is that Auschwitz should not be the organizing principle of Jewish identity. And that if we turn the Holocaust into the organizing principle for our communities, we're essentially not giving credit to the very way of life and traditions that were carried on by the people who were murdered in the Holocaust, and rather Sinai has to be our organizing principle. And I think that there's a tension between how much we are a people of memory, and it's important to carry forward that memory, and for that memory not to be lost. But we also, number one, I think she would argue that it's a different question for us to wrestle with that internally of what is the role of memory versus for the non-Jewish community, for the world to engage in that practice of memory at the cost of real live Jewish communities. Norma, just one other thing. Later in the book, she has a chapter called Blockbuster Dead Jews. And I'll just read a paragraph about, it's from page 187, where she raises the following question. She talks about going through the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and the incredible amount of history and depth and detail, et cetera, et cetera. And she says that the basic idea behind those museums is that if people learn about the Holocaust, then they will, essentially not let it happen again, right? That's the educational principle. If people know about it, then they won't let it happen again. And she says, I don't mean, she says, where is it? I'll just read this little paragraph. She says, perhaps we are giving people ideas about our standards. Yes, everyone must learn about the Holocaust so as not to repeat it. But this has come to mean that anything short of the Holocaust is, well, not the Holocaust. The bar is rather high. And she goes on to quote sort of, the shootings in San Diego and the shootings in Pittsburgh and the lobbing of missiles at of sleeping children in Israel during, from Gaza, and, people writing certain articles or whatever. And she says, there's all of this anti-Semitism. Maybe the idea that we've given people about emphasizing Holocaust education is not, hey, you should fight all anti-Semitism. But maybe what we've done is tell people that unless it's the Holocaust, it's okay, right? Like, don't worry about it, right? Because it's not yet the Holocaust. And I think it's it's an important critique, right? Like, I think it's a legitimate thing for us to be worried about, right? That when we do Holocaust education, that we not sort of use that as an excuse for, but if Jews aren't suffering genocide, there's really nothing to worry about, right? No, right? Like, there are there are actually concerning and real life things that are happening to Jews in this moment that that should also be of concern. Martha, go ahead.
There are so many things that I've been wanting to comment on that I hope I remember them all. The first thing I'll say is, to this point, at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has many branches, and one of them is the Committee on Conscience. They have many things that they do, and that has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It is a committee that really watches what goes on in the world, and they condemn all kinds of atrocities. So it is not true that it has to be anti-Semitism to be condemned.
No, of course not. Of course,
So
thank you.
That's one thing. The other thing is, I don't remember the circumstance, but I do remember vividly that Wiesel was asked to forgive. Will you forgive? And he said, it's not for me to forgive, it's for the dead to forgive. Only the dead can forgive. That was another thing. Then the other comment I had was, you made the point of the theological aspect of night. And yes, there is that in terms of Wiesel's anger at God for permitting this to happen. But really, Night is also a book about suffering. It is about suffering. Anne Frank's diary was not about suffering, really. It was about her adolescence. And Wiesel's adolescence was in Auschwitz, and hers was not in Auschwitz. And he does, you cannot imagine the kind of correspondence over the years he had while I was working for him, from young people, from students who read Night, Jews, non-Jews, in social studies classes and history classes, not just Hebrew schools. I would say as many non-Jewish students wrote to Wiesel. It touched them because it was about suffering, the suffering of a boy and his father. So it was a very personal story of suffering, not just anger at God.
I agree with you, and I hope you don't take anything, God forbid, as being critical of Elie Wiesel or anything like that.
I was just wanting to
But I'm curious, what do you make of that? What do you make of the fact that there was a change? And I'd have to look more at the scholarship around this, but it seems that the change was essentially at the behest of the publisher, right? To say the more angry and accusatory tone against the world, right, will not sell, can't get published, whereas an accusatory tone at God is something that made the book more relatable. Obviously, it includes, suffering, etc. But there, the argument is that there's a shift in focus that was maybe even necessary in order to make the book, in order to make the medicine go down.
This is a very controversial subject, and I am not well versed in the scholarship, but I know there are Wiesel proteges who are very angry about this whole scholarship about the Yiddish version. My take is that the Yiddish version was much earlier, and it was a response, almost an immediate response, to put down in writing the feelings that he had coming out of that experience. When he got to France, it was a distant experience. It wasn't an immediate experience. And I don't know that the idea of the universal purpose of Night was the reason. I really am not sure. I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, look, regardless, even if we set Wiesel aside, I do think that Dara Horn brings to the table a familiarity with, with most of the Yiddish scholarship. And I've read a few of those that have been translated into English. I think there's I forget the author, but there's a book called The Last of the Just, which is an extraordinary novel about the Holocaust that's much harsher in its condemnation.
Schwartzbart is the author.
Say it again.
Andre Schwartzbart.
Thank you. So, I think that I still think her point about needing to focus on sort of the responses in the literary responses of the population of the majority of the population of the people who were killed, as being something that gets less attention, and asking the question what that means. Let's take a few more. We're now going to hear husband and wife, Harold and Meg, and then I want to look at something that I want to look at, like a different excerpt. But go ahead, Harold.
So I'd like to make two quick comments related to some things that have been said. The first one is, so Meg and I have been listening to some webinars from the Hartman Institute about anti-Semitism in America. There have been two this last 2 weeks, and the third one is this coming Monday. And one point that came up in the first episode, and that he's going to comment on more, I think, on this coming Monday, is he says that the Jewish community hasn't used the legal or has been reluctant to use sort of legal tools that are available and that could be used to combat anti-Semitism in the US now. And that, as the point that was made earlier, that a lot of energy has gone into looking at things in the past and making making people aware of that. So I thought that was an interesting comment, and I'm interested to hear what he has to say this coming Monday. And the second thing about, there's another chapter in the book where he talks about this person, Varian Fry, who was sent to Europe with a charter from a private committee to save European culture. And I must say this, I'm guilty of this, right? I mean, this feeds into my biases, and I just appreciated so much Dara Horn pointing it out, because he went to save European culture, and of course, what that meant was to save the famous artists, composers, and so on, who were Jewish and who were trying to get out. This happened in Marseille. So these are people who had already escaped from Germany, but were caught in Vichy, France, and had to get out of Vichy, France. But as there's a quote from this person later on, and he says, no, we should be able to save them all. Why just the world's greatest painter, right? So you think of European culture. Well, European culture isn't just Mahler and so on. European culture was also the Hasidic culture of Yiddish-speaking Eastern Europe. That was European culture, and that was totally destroyed.
So Harold, I'm gonna sharpen this even further, and I am curious. In particular, Richard, you obviously worked in a university for a long time, as did many folks here, and Jews in general value secular education. We value reason, we value the accomplishments of academia, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, Harold, I'll have to look at it more closely. I'm not sure that this committee was only saving Jewish scholars. I think the idea was to save European culture. And it was both Jews, but also non-Jews who may have been persecuted or who were in harm's way. and there's a whole chapter about someone named Varian Fry who ran something called the Emergency Rescue Committee that brought essentially great authors and painters and musicians and other kind of leaders in secular culture out of France. And on page 164, I'm going to read you this paragraph. She writes, "It is easy to forget that there are other culture that there are other values a culture might maintain. Other people whom one could consider guardians of civilization instead of artists and intellectuals, and that a large proportion of the people who were actually murdered in the Holocaust adhered to one of these alternatives. Fry tried to save the culture of Europe, and for that he should be remembered and praised. But no one tried to save the culture of Hasidism, for example, with its devotion to ordinary everyday holiness, or Misnagim, the opposing religious movement within traditional European Jewry, Eastern European Judaism, whose energy in the years before the war was channeled into the rigorous study of Musar, or ethics. Entire academies devoted to the Musar movement were destroyed, their books burned out of the world, their teachers and leaders and scholars murdered, all the things that everyone feared would happen to the vaunted culture of Europe. No rescue committee was convened on behalf of the many people who devoted their lives and careers to what Pierre Sauvage laments no one pursues, the actual study of righteousness. For them, there were no Varian Fries." And I think her critique here is that there was that Fry's efforts, and he should be praised for doing something, right? But there was a valuing of what we'll call Western civilization over that of Jewish civilization. There was a sense that somebody from the West has to go in and get out the Mona Lisas of the Western, of the French and Western Academy. But there's not a valuing of Jewish academies and of Jewish culture. Nobody said we have to make sure to get out the great rabbis of these academies. There was no established effort to do that en masse. There were things, there were incidents, right? Abraham Joshua Heschel, made it out. But the question is, what would have happened if there was an entire emergency rescue committee to save people like Heschel, right? How many Heschels did we lose in the Holocaust because such a thing didn't exist that valued Jewish culture and not just Western culture? And, Meg, go ahead. Meg, you're on mute. I think Harold.
She's going to
Meg,
come over to
on
my
the way.
computer, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, while waiting, my screen froze.
Okay.
So I think it was really helpful in a lot of ways to figure out how to tell about the Holocaust so people who learn about it identify with people, the victims. And I think that's one thing behind this kind of whitewashing of Jewish culture. But on the other hand, I thought Martha's comment that so many young people wrote to Elie Wiesel about how touched they were by his story and what happened. A personal story like that does touch people, even if the world and culture the person came from is very different. The personal story and a good novel can grab people, even when it's describing something very different. So I just want to say that I think I can see the desire to make something universalist, but I think there's other ways to make something personal.
Thank you. So let me just pull a couple of more threads here. One of them, and if you have the book, I invite you to look on page 74 and 75. But she, Horn is not only an author herself, but also a scholar of literature. And she makes a point about there's an important book by Frank Kermode published in 1965 called The Sense of an Ending. And I'll read to you a little bit. She says, which essentially tries to explain the purpose of storytelling. And Kermode points out how much readers desire coherent and satisfying endings, and then connects that desire to the history of Western religion. And I'll pick up at the bottom of 74. She writes, but I very quickly saw the problem. This idea of religion imposing coherence on the world sounded absolutely nothing like the religion I knew best. Okay, and by the way, she says in the middle, just to go back a little bit, she explains that just as religion, or Kermode writes in his book, that just as religion urges us to see our world as an inherently meaningful place where events always serve some larger purpose, writers create that purpose within stories by making every detail add up to something meaningful, okay? And her point is that Kermode is saying, well, this is how all storytelling works, right? The world is meaningful and there's a bunch of details and it sort of all adds up into a coherent story that has meaning. And she says that that's what religions do, right? Or Kermode makes that argument. And she says, wait a minute, that doesn't sound like my religion, okay? And I'll read a little bit more. She says, Kermode's argument is based on the idea that Western religion is all about endings. As he puts it, the Bible is a familiar model of history. It begins the beginning with the words in the beginning, and it ends with a vision of the end with the words, even so, come Lord Jesus. Needless to say, this is not how the Hebrew Bible ends. The Tanakh, as Jews call the Hebrew Bible, has plenty of apocalyptic visions, but its final pages in the rather plodding book of Chronicles doesn't exactly end with a bang. It ends, by the way that the book of Chronicles, the way that the Tanakh ends is with a hopeful expectation that now that King Cyrus has permitted this, that Jews will return to the land of Israel. That's how the Hebrew Bible ends, with an expectation of Jews returning to the land of Israel. She says the Torah, the part that we read out loud, doesn't have much finality to it other than the expected death of Moses. It ends with a cliffhanger, stopping just before the Israelites' long-awaited arrival to the promised land. And here she says the characters never even make it home. It slowly dawned on me that Kermode's idea of religion giving us an ending isn't universal at all. It's Christian. And her point is that even our sense of what literature is, or her experience with, quote, what is literature and how does literature work, involves an erasure it involves the imposition of Christian values with being all religions, and that Jewish literature and Jewish texts speak a very different language. As you all know, you just finished Passover, where the point of the Passover Seder is not to come to the answer of the questions, of the 4 questions. It's to tell the story. And it's to argue about the story, and it's to ask questions, and it's not to tie everything up in a bow. And her point is that she writes later on page 79, she says, these Jewish stories present a challenge to the Western idea of the purpose of creativity. Stories with definitive endings don't necessarily reflect a belief that the world makes sense. but they do reflect a belief in the power of art to make sense of it. What one finds in a Jewish storytelling, though, is something very different, a kind of realism that comes from humility, from the knowledge that one cannot be true to the human experience while pretending to make sense of the world. These stories are without conclusions, but full of endurance and resilience. And I think this is an absolutely stunning and really important lesson about, again, are we willing to value the particular and different Jewish culture at least equally to Western culture, at least equally to Western literature, if not more? And how often do we erase or do we find that Jewish culture and Jewish lived literature is erased because the lens by which we're evaluating it is a Christian lens or a Western lens and not a Jewish lens? And how often in Western life does the rest of the world evaluate the utility or the value of Judaism based upon its standards? And that's what she means by people love dead Jews, because when you can have dead Jews, then they don't talk back, and you can make them into what it is that you need to make them, and the things that you need to learn, rather than respecting the difference of people who live differently and think differently and dress differently and eat differently and tell stories differently than you do. Right? Let me just stop for a second, but I found this, I loved literature, and I found this to be just a really, really challenging and helpful frame. Reactions, thoughts to that? Richard, I just threw a lot of the university and Western civilization under the bus. I'm just wondering if you want to rise up in defense or anything, but you don't have, I'm not going to appoint you the spokesperson.
I don't know that it has to be either or. That's what I say. Is certainly we should try to preserve Jewish thought and Jewish and all of Jewish thought, but that doesn't say that we individually can't do both. I don't think that we have to choose.
I like it. I agree. I don't want to choose. I want to hold both. And I think what we're doing is we need to have an evaluation of what needs emphasis. I think that, by the way, in the development of conservative Judaism took place in a time when people were deeply rooted in their Judaism, and conservative Judaism gave a pathway for American Jews to hold their traditional Judaism, but also to embrace American values and a lot of what's good about America. I would argue that now I think we're in a different place, because our children there's no doubt that our children are growing up with and our grandchildren are growing up with a deep sense of American values. But I worry that that our kids are not, not encountering enough or getting roots deep enough in terms of Jewish values. And so, I want to hold both. I don't want to let go of one or at the expense of the other, but we need to evaluate where are we, both individually and as a community. Judy, go ahead, and then I'll finish with one other excerpt.
So I have a question with regard to what you were just talking about. How important do you think it is in the education of our children? And I'm doing this over a fairly long spectrum of age when I ask this question, to point out some of the differences and distinctions between a Jewish framework or a Jewish point of view about something, and a non-Jewish or secular or Western, or whatever you want to call it, Christian. I don't think that is taught, and I'm wondering what you think about that.
I don't know that it's necessary. Here's my concern, and I'm not saying this because of anything you said, in specific, Judy, but I think that I think that there are Jewish communities, typically in the ultra-Orthodox world, that when they are teaching about Jewish particularity, it can veer into a demonization of either Christians or the non-Jewish world.
I wasn't thinking of demonizing. I was just thinking of pointing out differences.
Yeah, and I like I said, so I worry that is an aspect, obviously, that all of us should and want to stay away from. And so I think when we do point out those differences, we need to do so thoughtfully. I probably spend more of my time just being Jewish, right? Sort of just not even, talking about it, but just sort of doing it. And letting that speak for itself, letting the difference speak for itself. But I do think that there are times when it's important, when it's important and it can be useful. I think, by the way, when that happens, it's interesting. I have an article, it was written a long time ago by Rabbi Harold Schulweis, who was, she was the rabbi at my mom's synagogue in Oakland and then at Valley Beth Shalom for a long time. And he writes, it's called the hyphen between the star and the cross. And it's about intermarriage, and it's about the differences between Judaism and Christianity. And I will give it to couples sometimes. I will give it to couples sometimes. And what I have found is that many times the Christian person will come back to me and they will say, Rabbi Schulweis is not, he wasn't speaking mockingly or diminishing Christianity, but it's very interesting because my lived experience of Christianity, actually didn't include a lot of the way that it was described sort of doctrinally, right? So, for example, Harold, I can see you looking quizzically. So, for example, Schulweis will write about how classical Christianity understands the body as a source of sin, right? And as a source of irredeemable sin, which makes Jesus dying on the cross necessary in order for human beings to be redeemed and be able to go to heaven. And the person will say, like, I get it, right? It's not a misrepresentation of Christianity, but the church that I grew up in didn't talk about, how your body is terrible, right? And it just didn't emphasize that particular doctrinal aspect of things. And so, Judy, I think when we do point out those differences, we should do so obviously with humility and with an open heart to people who come along and say, it's very interesting, like that, my Christianity isn't actually isn't like that, right? I make that a precondition, obviously, of my interfaith work. That I really, I don't allow interfaith work where somebody is going to be proselytizing. I think it's harder. I can still do some interfaith work with people who think I'm going to hell, as long as they don't have to raise their voice about that or sort of tell me about it all the time, right? Because I understand, like, people have certain faith commitments and the whatnot. But I think, I'm always interested in how it is that people are living out those things, in the real world. We're over. Let me just do one quick other one. On page 57, she talks about Purim versus Hanukkah anti-Semitism. Purim anti-Semitism is you're Jewish, we want to kill you. And by we want to kill you, we mean we want to kill you. We want to kill all of you. She says Hanukkah anti-Semitism, and I'll just read a quote here, often employs Jews as its agents. That is a very interesting. It requires not dead Jews, but cool Jews. Those willing to give up whatever specific aspect of Jewish civilization is currently uncool. Of course, Judaism has always been uncool, going back to its origins as the planet's only monotheism, featuring a bossy and unsexy, invisible God. Uncoolness is pretty much Judaism's brand, which is why cool people find it so threatening, and why Jews who are willing to become cool are absolutely necessary to Hanukkah anti-Semitism's success. These quote unquote converted Jews are used to demonstrate the good intentions of the regime, which of course isn't anti-Semitic, but merely requires that its Jews publicly flush thousands of years of Jewish civilization down the toilet in exchange for the worthy prize of not being treated like dirt or not being murdered for a few years, maybe. And she actually, I know I'm over, but I will say there's one other place in the book that just related to that was a really interesting observation. She makes the argument, and I think very coherently, that essentially Hanukkah anti-Semitism is what the Soviet Union employed in essentially, during the time of the Soviet Union, and essentially erasing Judaism from being lived by Jews in the Soviet Union. And she writes, I don't know why I can't find this right now. She writes about going and speaking with a Soviet Jew who moved to Israel and escaped the Soviet Union. And she says that when she was interviewing this person, his name I think was like Asa or something like that. Let me see, maybe it's at the end of this chapter. She says, let me see if I can find it. All right, I'm not going to find it right now, but she essentially says the following. This person said to them, the Soviets were worse than the Nazis. And she's sort of taken aback, and the person says, I know exactly what the Nazis did, but the Soviets performed a sort of death of Judaism for millions and millions and millions of Soviet Jews, and this was the line. She said there was never a Nuremberg trial for Soviet Jews. Right? Nobody ever recognized, right? The world never recognized the way in which millions and millions of Jews in the Soviet Union were essentially had their identities erased for thousands of years. Somebody found it, it's on page 70. She says, thank you. She says, they never had a Nuremberg. They never acknowledged the evil of what they did. The Nazis were open about what they were doing, but the Soviets pretended. They lured the Jews in, they baited them with support and recognition, they used them, they tricked them, and then they killed them. It was a trap, and no one knows about it even now. People know about the Holocaust, but not this. Even in Israel, people don't know. And I think again, really important view of things that that when she's arguing that people love dead Jews, right? The corollary to that is that people don't, there's a hatred or a discomfort or a demand for erasing your Judaism as it's lived as an entrance to society. And I think her argument, Meg, have a good one. I think her argument is that we should never allow our Judaism, we should never pay that price of allowing our Judaism to be erased as the price for admission. And that actually a bigger point, which she makes at another point in the book, is that free societies, if you do want to make the canary in the coal mine argument, which she says is problematic, but societies that are free are societies that can that tolerate difference as difference, and that one of the reasons why anti-Semitism often goes along with the diminishment of overall societies is that when people stop tolerating Jews as Jews, what it means is that we're not going to tolerate difference at all. And again, that matters not because we're canaries in the coal mine. It matters because we matter, but it's an important point to make nonetheless. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.